He looked like a lost tourist. Why was he in my bedroom weeks later? The rain had turned from a drizzle into a determined, slanted downpour, soaking the streets and making everything gleam with a ghostly sheen under the streetlights. I was fumbling with my umbrella, trying to balance my bag and a steaming cup of coffee, when I saw him, tall, slightly hunched, squinting at a piece of paper in his hand like it might suddenly change and make sense. He looked completely out of place: tan trench coat, a navy backpack, sneakers that were far too clean to have walked these grimy streets for long. His hair clung to his forehead in damp curls, and his brow furrowed as he tried to match street names to what was clearly a printed map. Most people don't carry paper maps anymore. That was the first thing I noticed. I don't usually talk to strangers. But something about the way he stood, with that blend of determination and hesitation, made me pause. Maybe it was the foreign accent I caught when he asked a passerby for directions and was briskly ignored. Maybe it was the way he looked grateful when I made eye contact, as if just the acknowledgement of his presence was a small mercy. "Lost?" I asked, lifting my umbrella slightly to shield him as I approached. He smiled, sheepish. "Yes, I think completely. I'm looking for a hostel near River Street." I knew the place. A bit out of the way and certainly not where he was standing. I offered to walk him part of the route, since I was heading in the same direction. He hesitated, then nodded. As we walked, he introduced himself as Marius, said he was from Latvia, visiting for a few weeks to see museums and try real English tea. We didn't talk much. Just a few scattered observations about the weather, the architecture, and how badly his umbrella had failed him. But when we reached the corner where I had to turn, he looked genuinely sad to part ways. "Thank you," he said. I was getting very wet and very frustrated. "No problem," I said and smiled, thinking I'd never see him again. But I did, and that rainy meeting outside the train station would come to mark the beginning of a quiet unraveling I didn't yet recognize. 3 days later, I was in the bookstore I always retreated to when I needed silence. It's a quiet little place tucked between a flower shop and an antiques dealer, with uneven floorboards and narrow aisles that seem to whisper as you walk. I had just pulled a collection of translated poetry off the shelf when I heard a familiar voice say, "You have good taste." I turned. Marius stood just a few feet away, holding a slim book in one hand and a takeaway coffee cup in the other. He looked drier, more composed, his curls still slightly unruly but cleaner, and now that the trench coat was gone, I saw he dressed simply: navy sweater, dark jeans, that same navy backpack slung over one shoulder. "Marius?" I asked, half laughing. "What are you doing here?" "I told you," he said, smiling. "I came to explore. I find bookstores more comfortable than most tourist spots." It was a strange coincidence. Too neat, maybe, but I didn't question it. Not then. He gestured toward the little cafe in the corner of the shop and asked if I'd join him for a drink. I had an hour to kill, so I agreed. What followed was an unexpectedly long, intimate conversation. We talked about the books we loved, the places we dreamed of seeing, and his fascination with British idioms. He confessed that he sometimes carried a notebook just to jot down odd phrases people said. "I don't understand raining cats and dogs," he said, mock serious. "What do animals have to do with rain?" I laughed. I liked how curious he was, how attentive. He made me feel like my words mattered, like every sentence I spoke added something valuable to his mental collection. Before we parted, he asked if I had WhatsApp. I gave him my number. That evening, he messaged me a blurry photo of a pigeon on a pub sign and asked if "drunk as a coot" was a real expression. From then on, we talked every day. It didn't feel like flirting. Not exactly. But there was a warmth in his words, a kind of gentle persistence that slipped past my usual defenses. At first, the messages were light and spaced out. A meme here, a book recommendation there. But soon, they came every morning like clockwork. "Good day to you," he'd write, followed by something mundane and oddly comforting, a photo of his breakfast, a snapshot of a rainy street with his commentary, gray but peaceful. I started looking forward to those messages. They gave my mornings a strange sense of rhythm, as if I were waking up to something outside of my own inner monologue. It was subtle at first, but I began to let him in. I told him about my cat, about the loud neighbors upstairs, about the deadlines I kept pushing off. He responded with interest, always remembering the small things I'd said. Over the course of a few weeks, the messages evolved. He started calling me "my clever book lady" and signed off with "sweet dreams." Still, it never felt like he was crossing any line, more like he was filling a quiet gap in my life that I hadn't noticed before. He never asked for photos, never hinted at anything inappropriate. If anything, he was almost shy in his expressions. One night, I mentioned that I had insomnia. It was 1:00 a.m. I wasn't expecting a reply, but he responded almost instantly. "I'm awake too," he wrote. "Sometimes I pretend to be in another city. I imagine I'm somewhere colder, with snow piling against the windows." I replied, "Why colder?" He said, "Because in snow, the world quiets down. It stops expecting anything from you." That stayed with me. He didn't say more, but the vulnerability in that message made something shift. I started to sense a kind of loneliness in him, an emotional gravity that pulled me closer. A week later, he asked if I wanted to meet for a walk. We wandered through the park, where the leaves had turned to fire, colored blankets beneath our feet. We didn't touch, didn't hold hands, didn't flirt outright, but when we sat on a bench and he asked me what I'd wish for if I could have anything at all, I told him honestly, stability. A quiet life. Someone to trust. He nodded, staring out at the lake. Me too, he said. It's hard to know who to trust when you've always been the stranger. I didn't know then how much that sentence would haunt me later, but in that moment it felt like a shared secret, like a thread quietly tying us together. It was a Wednesday when he asked if he could stay over just for a night. The message came in the late afternoon. He said the hostel had made a mistake with his reservation and double-booked his room. It's just one night, he wrote. I can sleep on the floor if the couch is too much. I stared at the message for a long while. I had rules about this sort of thing. I lived alone for a reason, kept boundaries with people I didn't fully know, but by then Marius no longer felt like a stranger. He was part of my daily routine, embedded in it like coffee in the morning or brushing my teeth before bed. Still, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally typed, just one night, couch is fine. He arrived around 8, looking grateful and slightly embarrassed. He brought his own pillow, insisted on taking a quick shower to rinse the day off him, and emerged smelling faintly of mint and soap. We shared leftover pasta and a bottle of wine I had in the fridge. Conversation was easy, lighter than usual. He made me laugh, really laugh, for the first time in days. That night, I set up a blanket and an extra pillow on the couch. He thanked me again so earnestly that I felt almost guilty for making him feel like a guest. I'll be gone early, he said, curling up with his back to me. I don't want to intrude. But the next morning he was still there when I came out of the bedroom, sitting cross-legged, scrolling through something on his phone, a cup of tea in his hands. I raised an eyebrow. Thought you'd be gone, he shrugged. It's raining again. That became a pattern. One night turned into two. Two turned to excuse, shifted, rain, hostile mix-ups, a migraine, a lost wallet, but I didn't stop it. I told myself it was fine. I liked the company. The apartment felt warmer somehow, less silent, less haunted by the quiet. He wasn't overbearing. He did the dishes, took out the trash without being asked, even bought groceries once or twice. But his presence grew in small ways. An extra toothbrush appeared in the bathroom, his jacket slung over the back of a chair, his book left open on the coffee table. And then one morning, he made coffee before I'd even gotten out of bed. When I walked into the kitchen, he looked up and said, "Felt like home this morning. Hope that's okay." I smiled, unsure of how to answer. Because somewhere in the soft blur of those shared days, the line between guest and something else had started to blur. And I didn't know yet if that was comfort or danger. It began with the tiniest things. So small, in fact, I second-guessed myself each time. The first was a silver hoop earring I'd left on my dresser. I was certain I had placed both on the ceramic dish beside my perfume bottle, but the left one was gone. I checked the floor, the bathroom sink, even under the bed. Nothing. When I asked Marius if he'd seen it, he looked genuinely puzzled. "An earring," he said. "No, I don't think so. Maybe the cat took it?" I didn't have a cat. I let it go. I had always been a bit scatterbrained with jewelry. Maybe I'd lost it while taking off my sweater. Maybe it had rolled somewhere odd. The second time, it was a bottle of wine. I'd left it half full on the kitchen counter after a solitary night in, planning to finish it the next day. But when I returned from work, the bottle was gone. Not in the fridge, not in the trash. Just gone. Again, I asked him casually. He shook his head. "I thought it was yours," I said. "I was saving it?" His reply came too quickly. "Oh, maybe I threw it out by accident." I cleaned a little. Thought it was empty. That time, I did feel something shift. A slight, imperceptible crack in the trust that had been growing between us. But it was still minor, small enough to rationalize people make mistakes. Guests try to help and mess things up. It wasn't a pattern, not yet. But it became one. My notebook, the one I kept in the drawer by my bedside table, had pages dog-eared in places I hadn't touched. My perfume smelled different, like someone had sprayed it in the air just moments before I entered the room. Once, I came home to find a single cup in the sink that I knew I hadn't used. Marius was out that day, or so he said. He claimed he had gone to the library to do some reading. And yet the cup was warm. Still, whenever I confronted him gently, cautiously, he had answers. Always just enough explanation to make me feel silly. "You're tired," he'd say. Or, "Maybe you did it without thinking. That happens, doesn't it?" I wanted to believe him. He was still kind, still made tea in the mornings, still left notes like, "Hope today is kind to you." But a new feeling crept in, a thread of unease, woven quietly into our days. And most of all, I noticed how good he was at making me question my own memory. How softly he would say, "Are you sure?" when I brought something up. How he'd tilt his head, offer a concerned smile, and repeat that I worked too hard, that I was under too much stress. I started to wonder if maybe I really was losing things. Maybe the fault was mine. Maybe. It was a Thursday evening, the light outside dimming into that murky blue that signals the day's retreat, when it happened. We were sitting on the sofa, both with our legs curled up, soft music playing in the background. I had just finished telling him about my weekend plans, dinner with my sister, who was going through a breakup. I mentioned how she'd been struggling, how I was hoping to cheer her up with her favorite movie and some ridiculous dessert. Marius nodded, a little distractedly. "Yeah," he said. "She's been with that guy for years, right? Tall, wore glasses?" I froze. I hadn't said anything about the ex-boyfriend, not his name, not what he looked like, certainly not that he wore glasses. I turned toward him slowly. "How do you know that?" He didn't look at me right away. For the first time in a while, he seemed caught off guard. "You mentioned it," he said after a pause. "I think, maybe the first time we talked about your family." I knew I hadn't. I was careful about what I shared, especially back then. I had kept my personal details minimal, cautious. Yet here he was, confidently recalling something I never gave him. I nodded, pretending to let it go. But the weight of that moment pressed on my chest like a cold stone. It didn't make sense. And worse, it didn't feel like the first time. The more I thought about it, the more memories clicked into place. A few days earlier, he'd casually asked if my parents were still in the same house. I'd never told him where they lived. Once, when I had a headache and went straight to my bedroom without talking, he knocked on the door 10 minutes later with a glass of water and said, "You always get them around this time of the month, right?" I had mentioned my headaches, yes. But the timing, that was never discussed. It was like he had access to a version of my life I didn't remember giving him. That night, I waited until he was in the shower. I went to my phone, scrolled back through our messages, searching for any trace that I might have told him about my sister's ex. Nothing. I checked emails, notes, nothing. When he came out of the bathroom, towel around his shoulders, he looked at me and smiled. "You okay?" "Yeah," I lied, "just tired." But something had changed. I started watching him differently, not as a guest, not even as a friend, but as a question I hadn't yet figured out how to ask. Because there's a certain tone people take when they're telling the truth. And his had started to go missing. It was subtle, the way fear seeped into the edges of my life. I began locking my bedroom door at night, a habit I hadn't needed in years. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could sort through the strange coincidences. Just until I could make sense of the way Marius seemed to know things I'd never told him. The lock clicked each night with a sound that comforted and unsettled me in equal measure. Then came the evening I came home late from work. It had been a draining day, meetings, deadlines, too many faces. I arrived to find the apartment quiet, darker than usual. Marius wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. His shoes weren't by the door. For the first time in weeks, the space felt like mine again. I breathed deeply. The relief surprised me. I turned toward my bedroom and paused. The door, the one I always locked, the one that clicked shut behind me every morning, was ajar. Just slightly, maybe an inch. Just enough to show the darkness inside, the glint of metal from the lamp base, the corner of my unmade bed. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped my bag slowly and stepped closer, pushing the door open with just a fingertip. The room looked normal. Nothing obviously disturbed. No mess. No overturned drawers. But still, the air felt wrong, like it had been stirred and hadn't yet settled. I opened my closet. My clothes hung neatly as always. I checked the top drawer of my dresser. Everything in place. Then I moved to my desk. The drawer where I kept my passport was open. Not fully, just an inch or two, like someone had started to slide it shut and stopped halfway. My passport was still there. But it had been touched. The elastic band I kept around it, something I used to keep it from warping in the drawer, was gone. I stood still for a long time. When I heard the front door open, I jumped. "Marius?" I called, trying to keep my voice calm. He answered easily. "Yeah. Sorry I ran out for dinner. Thought you'd be late." He sounded normal, relaxed, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him outright. Instead, I waited. Watched him as we ate leftovers from the fridge, nothing special. He talked about a novel he was reading. I nodded, smiled, even laughed once. But my mind kept circling back to that door, that drawer, that feeling, that quiet, awful knowing. Later, after he fell asleep on the couch, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I kept replaying how the door had been left slightly open, like a mistake he hadn't meant to make, like a glimpse of something I was never supposed to see. That night I didn't sleep. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I had invited a stranger not into my home, but into my life. The next morning, I pretended nothing had changed. I handed him a cup of tea, asked about his book, smiled when he talked about his favorite pastries from the cafe down the road. But inside, I was unraveling, quietly, methodically. I needed to know what he was doing when I wasn't looking. That day, I left work early. I didn't tell him. I just showed up at the apartment at 3:00 p.m., heart racing as I slid the key into the lock. I pushed the door open slowly, barely breathing. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. His backpack was by the sofa, his jacket on the hook. From where I stood in the entryway, I couldn't hear anything. I stepped forward carefully, soft shoes barely making a sound on the wooden floor. And then I saw it, the door to my bedroom. It was open. He was inside, standing at my desk, my laptop open in front of him. He didn't hear me at first, his fingers flying across the trackpad, eyes focused. He looked comfortable, like he belonged there. Something inside me snapped. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He jumped. Actually jumped. His hands jerked away from the laptop, and for a second, he just stared at me like a deer caught in a sudden beam of light. I was just checking something," he stammered. "You left it open." I thought maybe I could look something up, just a bus schedule. I walked across the room, slammed the laptop shut. "Don't lie to me." He blinked. I wasn't. "You don't look up bus schedules in someone else's personal folders." He raised his hands, trying to calm me. "Okay. You're right. I'm sorry, I panicked. I thought you'd be home later, and I was curious." Curious? My voice cracked. "About what?" "About my emails, my documents, my life." He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. His shoulders slumped. "I don't know. I'm not good at boundaries, okay? I didn't mean anything bad." I stared at him. He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. I felt cold all over. My hands trembled. He stepped forward, cautiously, as if trying to undo what had just happened. "I didn't take anything," he said softly. "I swear. Sometimes I want to feel closer to people than I should." He looked sad and tired. Not menacing, not angry, but that didn't make it better. "I want you to leave," I said. He nodded slowly. "Okay, I understand." He packed his things in silence. No pleading, no dramatic excuses, just a quiet, subdued compliance. But as he walked out the door, he turned and said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just trying not to feel alone." And then he was gone. But the unease didn't leave with him. Because I still didn't know exactly what he'd seen. Or what else he'd taken that I hadn't yet discovered. I didn't tell anyone for the first 2 days. It felt too surreal, too delicate, like speaking it aloud would break something I hadn't fully understood. I changed the locks. I ran antivirus scans on my laptop. I reset passwords, covered my webcam with tape, and slept with the bedroom door not just locked but barricaded. But the feeling wouldn't lift. The feeling that I had been watched long before I ever opened my door to Marius. Then, on Saturday, I went to the pharmacy, just a normal errand, restocking shampoo, vitamins, the usual. The woman behind the counter was elderly, kind-eyed, someone I'd seen a handful of times over the years. We'd never spoken much beyond the basic small talk. That day, as she rang up my things, she tilted her head and said, "Your boyfriend's been in a lot lately?" I blinked. She smiled. "That tall one, dark hair accent. He came in last week asking about something for sleep. Then again 2 weeks before that, vitamins, I think." I felt my throat tighten. "He was here." She nodded, frowning now at my expression. "Yes, hasn't he been here with you before?" "No," I said, slowly. "He only arrived in town a month ago." She gave a small, uncertain laugh. "Oh no, dear. I remember him from at least October, maybe earlier, always polite, always asking questions." My hands were suddenly cold around the paper bag. I forced a smile, paid, and walked out of the store on legs that didn't quite feel mine. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. If she was right, and I believed she was, then Marius had lied about everything, not just his hostile mishap. Not just the bus schedules and my laptop, everything, his tourist persona, his wide-eyed questions, the notebook he used to jot down phrases like some eager newcomer. He hadn't just wandered into my life. He had been watching it. That evening, I pulled out my old journals, scanned through pages from the past 6 months, hunting for anything odd. A mention, a name, an impression I might have overlooked. But there was nothing concrete. Only the growing realization that I had been someone's project. A puzzle he'd quietly studied, collected, and finally inserted himself into. I remembered now how he knew the name of the dog from the park, a dog I'd only mentioned once, offhand, months before we met. How he had known which brand of tea I liked before I ever served it. It wasn't intuition, it was preparation. That night, I dug through my inbox and searched his name, his email, even fragments of phrases he'd used. Nothing. Then I tried one last thing. I dragged a photo of him into a reverse image search. And waited. When the results loaded, my stomach dropped. There were other names, other faces in the background of his photos, and an old forum post linking one of the images to a local thread from a nearby town with a warning. "Be careful. He watches before he appears." The image search turned up more than I could have imagined. I stared at the screen, the room silent except for the hum of my laptop fan. The photo of Marius, or whoever he really was, had been posted by someone named Bexnen74 on a neighborhood safety forum in a town just 2 hours from mine. The thread was nearly a year old and titled, "Strange Man Seen Watching Houses Near the University." The first post was simple: a warning, a grainy surveillance image, and a brief description. "He's been spotted near the student flats 3 times this month. No one knows who he is. Seems to loiter and leave when approached. Police haven't done anything yet." I clicked through the replies. More people chimed in. Similar descriptions. Variations on the same behavior: watching from a distance, sometimes pretending to talk on the phone, asking odd questions, showing up in libraries, coffee shops, even outside gyms. Someone uploaded a sharper photo, the same face, same dark curls, same blue-gray eyes. My stomach turned. I scrolled further. One user had commented, a full name Marco Salinix. A quick search led me to an old local news piece, barely a paragraph long, buried in the archives of a community newsletter. Local man Marco Salinix questioned in connection with harassment complaints, no charges filed, advised to cease contact with students at Greenway University. There was a photo. It was him. Not Marius. Marco. I leaned back, hands trembling slightly, trying to take it all in. He hadn't just shown up out of nowhere. He had a history, a pattern, and I wasn't the first person he'd done this to. I felt a wave of nausea. I wanted to scream, to cry, but mostly I just felt foolish. Because I had let him in, I had let him sleep under my roof, share my meals, borrow my charger, exist inside my silence. And he had taken everything, not things I could list or itemize, but pieces of my routine, my comfort, my sense of privacy. I knew I had to act. I printed out the images, saved everything, the links, the photos, the screenshots of our messages. I drafted a letter to the police. I knew they might not take it seriously. There were no threats, no theft, no violence, but still, I had to try. Before I hit send, I looked through the photos one more time. In some, he was smiling. In others, he looked different. Not menacing, just tired. As if the face he wore with me, soft-spoken, curious, affectionate, had been one of many he could slip in and out of. But there was one thing I knew now for certain. He had never been lost outside that train station. That map he held. It was probably just a prop. He had already known exactly where I lived. That night, I locked my door with a kind of desperation that made my hands shake. Not just the turn of the key, I shoved a chair beneath the handle, dragged my dresser 2 inches closer to the doorframe, and placed a metal spoon against the tile so it would clatter if nudged. These weren't things I'd ever done before. They were survival strategies that seemed more instinct than reason. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, fully clothed, phone in hand, thumb resting near the emergency call button. I kept thinking about the first night he stayed over, how easily I had let it happen, how I told myself it was temporary, how I smiled through the growing unease because politeness felt safer than confrontation. Now, the silence of the apartment felt sinister. Every creak, every shift of the wood in the walls, made me jump. The next day, I called the police. I gave them the screenshots, the photo comparisons, the forum threads. I expected them to dismiss me, and for a moment it seemed they might. But then the officer asked for his real name again and stepped out of the room. When she returned, her face had changed. "We've had reports," she said carefully. "Not from this city, but not far." He uses aliases. Usually targets women living alone. That confirmation should have brought relief. Instead, I felt the ground fall away beneath me. The officer asked if I wanted to file a formal report. I said yes. I told them everything, at least, almost everything. I didn't say how much I'd wanted to believe his version of himself. I didn't say that some nights, even now, I still reread his earlier messages, trying to figure out where the performance had begun. Back at home, I moved through the apartment like it was unfamiliar. I checked behind doors, opened closets twice, unplugged my laptop every time I left the room. Then came the moment I found the box. It was tucked behind the washing machine in the small laundry nook I rarely used. A cardboard shoebox sealed with a single strip of electrical tape. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, photographs. Not of me, not most of them, but of places I'd been. My favorite bench in the park, the coffee shop near my office, a photo of the outside of my building, taken from across the street at sunset. Then at the bottom, a few folded pages, notes, little fragments of writing, some mine copied from my social media posts, others handwritten in an unfamiliar style. She drinks lemon water in the morning. Only double locks the door when her neighbor leaves town. Watches old French films when sad. My breath left me in a sudden rush. I sat on the floor, knees against my chest, trying to steady my heartbeat. This hadn't been chance. He had been preparing, learning, calculating. And I had never seen it coming. He vanished without a trace. The morning after I handed the box over to the police, I awoke to silence, a silence so complete, it felt unnatural. I crept through the apartment half, expecting to find something. A note slid under the door, a scuff on the floor, an open window. But there was nothing. He didn't come back for his backpack. Didn't text, didn't call. His number, once so familiar on my screen, now rang to an empty signal. His messaging icon was suddenly grayed out. Gone just like that, for a week. I waited for movement, something, anything. But no one could find him. Not the police, not the neighbors, not even the security cameras near the train station. It was like he had dissolved into the cracks of the city. I kept the apartment locked at all times. I started using the deadbolt even when I was home. I covered the peephole with a sticky note. My curtains stayed drawn, the sun didn't matter anymore. And then, one late afternoon, I found something he'd left behind. It was buried in the side pocket of a coat he'd hung in the hall closet, a coat I hadn't touched since he left. Inside the pocket was a single photograph. It was me, walking, alone, carrying groceries. The angle was slightly elevated, like it had been taken from a bus window or the top of a stairwell. It was dated, time-stamped in the corner, from a full month before we'd ever met, at the train station. On the back, written in small, neat handwriting, was just one word: perfect. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there in the middle of my apartment, holding the picture like it might crumble if I breathed too hard. Later, after a long, dreamless sleep, I started searching the apartment again. Not for him, for signs of what he'd left behind. And I found them, slowly. A corner of a notepad tucked behind the fridge, a set of tiny folded receipts in the bathroom trash, a packet of unmarked keys in the lining of the couch. It was like his presence hadn't left. It had scattered, broken apart into fragments too small to detect all at once. He had touched everything, even the places I didn't think of as mine anymore. It would take months before I stopped checking over my shoulder. Before I could pass a bookstore or cafe without flinching. Before I could answer a knock at the door without the sudden tightness in my throat. But his absence wasn't comfort. It was a shadow, and shadows, I learned, are hardest to see just before they return. When I finally sat down across from the officer, I told her what I could. His real name, his patterns, the photos, the notes, the strange way he had entered my life under the guise of coincidence. I handed her everything, neatly compiled in a folder: timestamps, screenshots, the forum threads from that other town, but there were pieces I didn't mention. I didn't tell her about the conversations I still heard in my head, soft, harmless fragments of our time together. His voice asking, "What makes you feel safe?" The way he'd whisper goodnight through the door on evenings when I said I needed space. I didn't tell her that a part of me, the part that had once felt lonely enough to welcome him in, still wondered if any of it had been real. The officer listened carefully. She asked questions, took notes, promised to escalate the case to a different department. But I knew the truth even before I left that office. There would be no arrest, no courtroom. There was no definitive crime to prosecute. He hadn't broken in, I had let him in. And that, more than anything, was what haunted me. Back at home, I boxed up everything. The chair he used to sit in, the mug he favored, the blanket he always stole from the back of the sofa. I threw away the little notes he'd left, but not before reading them one last time. One of them, folded into quarters and tucked beneath a kitchen drawer, read, "If I had been someone else, maybe this could have been real." It hit me harder than I expected. Because in that one line, I saw the truth. He wasn't a monster. Not exactly. He was broken in places I would never understand. Desperate in ways I couldn't fix. He didn't know how to belong, so he stole closeness instead, borrowed it like a costume, and I'd been his mirror. Someone calm, routine, bound, kind. Someone he could mold himself around. A year passed. Then another. Eventually, changed my number. Started over in a small, coastal town where no one knew my name. I still check locks, still cover my webcam. But the fear has faded, like a bruise that lingers longer than the wound. Sometimes I see men who resemble him, at a bus stop, across a crowded cafe. In the blurred window of a passing train, my stomach clenches for a second, but it always passes. I learned to live again. Not because I forgot, but because I learned to trust myself more than the comfort of strangers. These stories show the consequences and limits of trusting strangers. It's not always the loud betrayals that leave us broken. Sometimes it's the quiet invasion, the kind that comes wrapped in warmth with soft voices and borrowed routines. I learned that manipulation doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like kindness with conditions. Sometimes it wears your favorite sweater and cooks your breakfast. And sometimes it leaves before you're ready, leaving behind only the echo of what you thought was real. If you've ever had a stranger turn your world upside down, share your experience in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe.